Welcome back for episode 11 of the Astronomical Apocrypha, the Seleukid Empire narrative let's play for Rome 2 with Divide et Impera. Last time, Euclid and Diogenes made their trek through the highland plains and jungles of Ethiopia, tracking down the Mero to their eponymous capital city. After capturing, losing, and then recapturing the city, the elusive Mero armies were finally tracked down and dealt with by the two generals, opening their attack with the night assault by Diogenes, who was subsequently joined by the remainder of the Seleukid forces. Antiochos Theos, with a little help from Kyrene, intercepted a Ptolemaic army en route to Perotonion, destroying their fortified encampment and marching on to capture the final Ptolemaic settlement at Aminium. Antiochos Theos was briefly incapacitated, although not from wounds suffered in battle or foul play. Antigonos Doson, a Macedonian exile and grandson of Demetrius the Besieger, briefly took over command of the Thunderbolts while Antiochos recovered, and now the two cousins have boarded the ships of Cordylion's fleet to make the perilous voyage toward the Balkan Peninsula and the next leg of the quest for Seleukid domination in the Wars of the Diadochi.
That's the God King himself over there, retching over the side.
Yes, he's been unwell periodically.
Seasickness this time? What was it before? Heat exhaustion? Battle fatigue? Overexertion with the concubines? How many excuses does a god need for his overindulgence in wine?
You speak frankly and boldly, Cordylion.
One cannot be timid or hesitant on the high seas, Antigonos. I'm not afraid of Antiochos the Younger or the Elder. They're respected and obeyed, but I'm the one who enables their conquest. You will find yourself in a position of power before long, but although they will call you king, you will be another of their satraps in effect.
I'm not ungrateful to the Seleukids for elevating me.
Nor I, of course, but when you find your political station unsatisfactory, remember this conversation.
Antiochos Soter has waited patiently in Thrace, but the time is finally ripening for the conquest of Macedon. In the cold of the winter, Alcandre has spied a large Macedonian army sheltering in their fortifications outside of their newly claimed territory from the Triballii, while another sizable force has taken up residence inside the town itself, leaving their capital at Phillipopolis defended only by its garrison and residents, and more than a season's march from the reinforcements. Off to the south, Antiochos Theos has landed his army, the Thunderbolts of Zeus, on the southernmost tip of the Peloponnese, immediately adjacent to yet another Macedonian force. Their army is a little worse for wear from the journey, but now replenishing thanks to our ally Epiros. Before we plunge the Hellenic world into all-out war, however, we have unfinished business in Ethiopia. Diogenes has now reached the unwalled Mero settlement of Axum, finding the battle quite frankly not worth the time, although we could likely spare a few more lives with a manual assault. We'll replenish these losses with time, and Diogenes likely sees this merely as a culling of the weak from the herd. The battle result annihilates the Mero as a faction, leaving the Blimii the only unfriendly force in our backyard of Northeast Africa. And also in keeping with his new mascot, Diogenes is going to rename his army accordingly. Euclid has consulted the goose, and the goose has spoken. The Blimii are not to be trusted. The man who's known for walking his own path takes it upon himself to declare war on the Blimii, in spite of our trade agreement. This will damage Antiochos Soter's reputation to a degree, and strikes preemptively at the nearby Blimii force, who are still keeping an eye on us at Miro, driving back the weakened army and following up his victory with a second strike to wipe them out entirely. We have a huge wealth surplus to do with as we please this turn. I wind up spending about 10,000 of it upgrading settlements and military facilities in Mesopotamia, with Archae Bosphoros now having expanded into Armenia adjacent to our territories in Cappadocia and Mesopotamia. We have the capacity to support at least 1 or 2 additional armies, so in response to the whispers among the Seleukid people that Antiochos Soter has left his true home territories in Syria and Mesopotamia undefended while allocating the entirety of his military strength to conquest, he has commissioned another army under the excellent Euclid. Given his own hoplite retinue and heroic hoplite companion, this will make an excellent spear-heavy force, although I'm going to start with the relatively cheaper Greek Toxotai for now. Antiochos Soter now makes his first move against Macedon, cutting off their trade and military access treaties. Alcandre has a very nice successful result in her steel provisions attempt against Anisodorus and Athena's faithful, blocking their return to Phillipopolis. Antiochos Soter moves in threateningly but does not assault the city yet. Antigonos Doson has meanwhile made his arrival at Odessos after traveling on from Cordylion's fleet, and he finds the training facilities lacking, ordering an immediate upgrade to the hoplite barracks. I'm going to raise yet another army now under Antigonos Doson, again starting with the archers to keep costs down. We've completed the Vae Victis Chapter 4 primary objective of subjugating 13 factions, earning us the nice reward of 10,000, although I once again wasn't able to make the bonus objectives happen. We could have deferred the completion of this chapter until subjugating Macedon, although that in turn would have delayed our military efforts in Ethiopia. And I'm not sure I want to make Macedon a satrapy anyway. Chapter 5, Excelsior, beckons us ever upward in our conquest, requiring us to control 15 provinces through direct control and/or satrapies and military allies. Our bonus objectives include holding the entirety of Macedonia and Thracia, declaring war on Parthia, and to have 10 regiments of Indian elephants. We do need to start looking eastward, as I have to get Bactria back at some point to meet the victory conditions, and now they've come under the control of the perpetual villain Takashila, and both Parthia and our source of Indian elephants lay in this direction as well. First to our business in Thracia and Macedonia, however. Antiochos Soter moves up to confront Athena's faithful in the mountain pass west of Phillipopolis. I was going to try to set up an ambush, but I believe I'm too close to the enemy army to make it happen now. However, it's the impetuous Antiochos Theos who fires the opening salvo, assaulting the Macedonian army in Attica. We're joined in the war by our satrapies and allies, and thankfully that includes Epiros. Antiochos Theos wipes out the enemy army and continues his replenishment in allied territory, while Cordylion brings his fleet in for a blockade against Pella. With his son having set in motion an unstoppable chain of events, Antiochos Soter now has no choice but to go on the offensive, attacking the Macedonian army before they can reach Phillipopolis. This is actually a fairly elite force with numerous white shield pikemen, along with a couple of regiments of the famous Thessalian cavalry. Although we're given the upper hand in the balance bar, it's not by much, so we'll have to fight this one ourselves. We're setting up in a valley with a few low hills, and I'm going to take command of one of these and force the Macedonians to make their advance on the position or suffer the consequences. My inferior pikes are at the top of the ridge, and the hoplites are off to the right. But hidden at the base of the hill are the fierce Thracian swordsmen and our own Greek Thureos swordsmen. Even with the excellent enemy cavalry, however, our ace remains Antiochos and his own citizen cavalry who start the battle hidden in the trees on the southern edge of the battlefield. The enemy general is smartly sending in his own cavalry to harass our flanks as he makes his advance. A unit each of the Prodromoi medium missile cavalry and Thessalian cavalry on each side, as well as some Sarissa lancers on our southern flank. As the cavalry close in, this sends our archers running back to the pike line, and although it's very close, the Sarissa lancers wind up mostly getting skewered by our pike phalanx from their bold maneuver. Nearby, the Thessalian cavalry take a punishing volley of javelins from our Thureophoroi before engaging them in melee. And as Antiochos and his own cavalry erupt from the foliage, the horsemen from Thessaly wheel about in alarm, trying to escape but instead colliding with the rear of our southernmost pike regiment, and they end up getting mauled by the surrounding units. On our opposite wing, the other Thessalian regiment are literally fighting an uphill battle against our hoplites, although the adjacent missile cavalry have paused and keep their distance on the far north side for the moment, and I send our Cappadocian levy spearmen to chase them off. The aggravating missile cavalry elude our infantry on the right, and also our citizen cavalry on the left, skirmishing away and making me pay for getting too close to them. With the enemy infantry now closing and making their climb up the hill, I'm forced to pull back my units on the right to engage the northern end of the enemy line. The brief gap in our line has allowed the remaining Thessalian cavalry regiment to slip through, which is quite disconcerting, but fortunately I have an adjacent regiment of Thracian swordsmen who can engage them in melee and protect our vulnerable archers and artillery. On the far southern side, Antiochos has finally trapped the enemy missile cavalry in the trees, and its superior number and quality of horsemen make quick work of the prodromoi. This is fortunate because as the main infantry battle commences, it's clear they're going to be able to begin moving around our flank with their Agrianian mercenaries. They never get the chance, however, as Antiochos and his cavalry rapidly close in from the edge of the trees and begin striking down the swordsmen from horseback. My Thynia Rhomphiophoroic infantry, though weakened, have finished off the Thessalian cavalry behind our line, and begin moving in to assist their brethren on the front line. Meanwhile, Antiochos and the cavalry, though easily winning, are bogged down by the sheer number of men in the Agrianian unit, and I simply decide they aren't worth the effort. We might win this fight, but I need my cavalry to hit the Macedonian flank to win the battle. So I pull Antiochos and the citizen cavalry through, ignoring the losses, and smash the majority of the cavalry into the levy pikemen on the southern flank, and leaving one citizen cavalry regiment behind to wheel about and make a second charge into the Agrianian swordsmen, hopefully holding them off for now. Antiochos makes quick work of the Epistratoi, breaking them up, and this is the relief that my Thureophoroi need to win their fight, which up to this point was 2-on-1. Antiochos pulls through the first regiment of demolished levy pikes to assault the next, driving those off as well, and now we have added a unit of swordsmen to our momentum, pushing from south to north along the hilltop. Still hanging in there but left in the dust are the Agrianian swordsmen, who now suffer another citizen cavalry charge as Antiochos now makes his presence known in the enemy rear, charging one of their infantry skirmisher regiments. The morale effect is tremendous as the Seleukid king runs rampant through the enemy rear, and although their own general Anisodoros is now reaching the hill and their northern group is holding strong, the southern side of the enemy line is beginning to collapse. Having driven off the missile infantry, Antiochos and his cavalry turn their attention to the white shield pikemen, who are slowly pushing back at our own inferior clericoi pikes from the crest of the hill, and as the archers pour in arrows from overhead, the Seleukid king plows into the rear of the southern enemy wing. Anisodoros, having seen this, rushes in with his regiment of elite shield-bearer spearmen to reinforce his men, but with one of the white shield regiments driven off, this is the beginning of the avalanche that leads to Seleukid victory. Antiochos pulls his cavalry back temporarily to avoid being caught up in the Macedonian general's path, leaving instead an advancing pike wall to fend off Anisodoros and the Thureophoroi swordsmen to finish off the Macedonian white shields. The Macedonian shield-bearers form up in a sort of wedge, trying to push through the pike phalanx, but they're held off for now, as Antiochos and his cavalry swing around further toward the enemy rear, angling for a charge on their general's retinue and the center of the enemy line. Having lost one unit of citizen cavalry, Antiochos sends the regiment accompanying him into the rear of Anisodoros' men, directing the other to strike the final blow against the white shields on the left, while Antiochos' own retinue begins galloping as fast as possible up the backside of the slope, intent on delivering the decisive blow to shatter the enemy center. The charge has the intended effect, the epicenter of the morale shock spreading outward to the adjacent regiment, punching a gigantic hole right in the center of the Macedonian line. Freed from their engagement on the crest, the Thracian warriors plunge through to sweep down the hill at the small group of rallied Macedonian spearmen, who, seeing the tide of barbarian swordsmen frothing at the mouth, almost immediately go back to running. Anisodoros seems to have noticed this as well, as it's only a few more seconds before the general, his retinue, and what's left of the enemy army fall to pieces en route. Another few minutes are spent mopping up the fleeing units, and as you can see, we've managed to devastate most of the enemy force, leaving only a few units alive, although suffering some pretty serious losses of our own. There's some question of whether I ought to pursue here, with the remnants of Athena's faithful having fled in the direction of the reinforcements and the garrison at Navissos. But fortunately, Antiochos' night battle ability lets us pick apart the survivors in an auto-resolve. Nevertheless, this puts Antiochos in range for the enemy retaliation should they desire. Antigonos Doson moves his force up to the border between Odessos and Phillipopolis, adding some Phillipopolis sword infantry to the army. Conjuring the memory of his great-grandfather, the Antigonid patriarch, Monophthalmos, he renames his army the Sons of the Cyclops, and for his household retainer taking the old one-eyed veteran, who gives us some reasonable bonuses for authority, morale, and missile fire rate. To the west in Navissos, Alcandre has another successful sabotage attempt against the enemy army taking up residence there, which may prevent them from reaching Phillipopolis but still leaves Antiochos Soter's army in range. In Ethiopia, Diogenes moves up north to the small forested area of Axum, setting up a concealed position for his army should the Blimii venture this way to retaliate, while Euclid does the same, bringing the wisdom of the goose to the northern border of Miro, also setting up an ambush stance. With our large cash surplus from the chapter completion, I'm now adding some proper hoplite infantry to Euclidus' army, the Spear of Ares. It takes almost everything else left in the bank to initiate the settlement upgrade at Seleukid to Tier 3. During the intern phase, the Antigonids, as expected, do strike back at Navissos. I was hopeful that Alcandre's sabotage attempt would allow the dragons to make a successful retreat. However, we're still unable to get beyond the enemy range. Although we have more units, our overall number of troops are about the same. The unit quality isn't that much superior to what we're fielding, so I'm a bit surprised to see the balance bar so far in the enemy favor. It could be a tough fight, but it goes without saying that this one will require some manual direction. The battle map is not dissimilar to the previous one, although the terrain is flatter this time. As the Antigonids make their advance against the Lithobolus shot raining down, Antiochos and his weakened cavalry regiments make their flanking maneuver on the southern side. There is a unit of Macedonian skirmish cavalry on the enemy's southern wing that for now are sticking with their main line, but we have to be very careful of them, particularly with our own regiments in such a weakened state. I spread out our own cavalry in a loose arc from the front to the rear of the enemy line, on its southern flank, in order to ensnare the enemy cavalry should they deviate from their close position to the advancing line. A few moments before the Macedonian army reaches the range of my own archers, the skirmish cavalry suddenly break hard away from their advancing line, heading right for Antiochos, the temptation of dispatching the Seleukid king apparently too much for them to resist. As they pass between my citizen cavalry regiments, I start closing the snare, and they react extremely quickly, moving with extraordinary speed to escape back to the safety of their own army. Spinning about, first moving west, then jerking their horses back east. They don't even pause their mounts to launch a volley of javelins at my citizen cavalry. Unbelievably, their unit seems to stretch itself very thin and then press their mounts even harder, narrowly escaping the pursuit of my citizen cavalry, although now they're walled off from the safe retreat, forced to head toward the perimeter of the battle. As they raced past Antiochos' retinue, they even managed to launch some of their missiles into the ranks of his men, although the companion cavalry are sturdy enough to hold up to a single volley. Antiochos and his citizen cavalry continue their pursuit of the Macedonian skirmish cavalry, and they head off close on their heels, apparently neither losing nor gaining ground. By this time, the rest of the enemy force have nearly closed with our army, and the archers square off for a short preliminary phase of the combat, and I'm able to get a few arrows into the opposite unit of Hippocontesti skirmish cavalry on the northern side. Antiochos does eventually manage to catch the enemy skirmish cavalry, although it's thanks only to the battlefield boundary, which traps the enemy horsemen who line up bizarrely along its edge and are forced to receive the devastating heavy cavalry charges, shattering their unit in almost no time. Following this, Antiochos and his men set off at their own version of a breakneck pace to reach the main battle where a melee has developed between the two front lines. We have by now developed a tenuous lead, but as you can see, many of our units are already at quarter strength or less, and there's a serious risk of a couple of retreating regiments precipitating a full army rout. Fortunately, the enemy have mostly bunched up their smaller number of regiments against our spears on the right, who have better armor and morale, while my Thracian swordsmen and Philiopolis have quickly mopped up the smaller southern wing of the enemy attack. As my own victorious units on the left-hand side make their way to the enemy flank, the 1st Regiment of Citizen Cavalry reach the enemy rear, driving back some terrified Macedonian infantry skirmishers before running them down, just as Antiochos and the remainder of the Citizen Cavalry swing around to plow into the rear of the main enemy attack. We already had a unit of archers run off due to failure of morale, while the Cappadocian levies are not far behind. The addition of a regiment of Macedonian missile infantry who draw their knives and enter the melee are just too much, and the Cappadocians are now permanently gone. This in turn causes the adjacent hoplite to start to waver. Though we seem to be winning, this is still an extremely precarious state. Fortunately, as more of my own regiments add their strength to the fighting, a couple of enemy spear and pike infantry waver and then break, and finally it seems the tide of the battle is turning in our favor. Another rear charge from the remaining unit of citizen cavalry is quite small in terms of numbers of horsemen, but it still seems to carry enough weight to push the scales of victory completely to our side. Though not significantly reduced in number by the fighting, the enemy general's retinue is broken and surrounded by our army, and he and his men don't stand a chance. This is a huge victory for Antiochos Soter, and I really didn't know if we would be able to pull this one off, but he's now managed to effectively destroy 2 of the Macedonian armies, while his son Theos has already destroyed a 3rd in the south. Cordylion's fleet gets chased back out of the port by the garrison at Pella, and he anchors his ship in the coastal inlet to the east. We've finished research on the siege tower, just in time it seems, and we're also conveniently able to exploit the prophecies of the oracle at Delphi for our own purposes, giving us another 4 turns of public order benefit and a wealth boost like the recent feast of Thesmophoria. Antiochos Soter's army is now quite weak, and though we couldn't possibly capture Phillipopolis in this state, I think we have enough strength for Navissos, which likely hasn't recovered its garrison since being so recently captured from the Triballii. The dragons of Bel Marduk easily overwhelm the settlement and capture it, and we don't even need to guide them to victory this time, suffering slight losses in the auto-resolve. Antigonos Doson and his small force move in to besiege Phillipopolis. They too will be unable to capture the city, but it should cause the Macedonians some difficulty in replenishing their armies as we slowly suffocate them with the siege. Antiochos Theos moves up from Attica into Larissa, right up to the border with Macedonian-held Pella, gathering strength for one more turn, as Cordylion heads back in to harass the Antigonids with his blockade. Down in Ethiopia, Euclid has reached Ptolemais Theron, first quickly dispatching the tiny enemy army there in a night battle, although the balance bar doesn't give us very good odds against the city garrison. Diogenes, meanwhile, is still closing in on the settlement, having reached the southern border of the region, but still not in range this turn. Both Cordylion and Antigonos Doson are chased off from their attempts at blockade and siege respectively, but otherwise the Macedonians have little to offer in the way of resistance. Euclid too falls back before a combined assault from the Blemmii forces at Ptolemais Theron. Examining the diplomacy panel, I noticed that the Archae, though quite hostile to the Antigonids, are actually cautiously friendly toward our faction and the Epirotes. I have no plans for the time being to expand further north or west, potentially exposing ourselves to the innumerable northern barbarian tribes, so they would perhaps make a convenient natural buffer if they could be convinced to become allies. For now, they're interested in trade and are willing to pay handsomely, so this makes a nice and mutually beneficial start to our diplomacy with them. Now that I have some more money to work with, Antigonos Doson is able to continue growing his force, adding still more sword infantry, this time of the Thracian variety. With the rest of my money, Cordylion gathers up all of the mercenaries he can muster from the local waters, which includes some actually very nice Rhodian and Cretan missile ships, and heads in for his 3rd blockade attempt against Pella. Antiochos Theos then sets up his siege at the southern walls of the city, and starts construction of our new medium siege tower apparatus. Euclid and Diogenes are now trying to wrap up their business in Ethiopia. Euclid's army is a bit underpowered and likely not a good match for the Ethiopian force, even one-on-one. Diogenes moves the Golden Fleece in to assault the city from the southern approach, and finds reasonable odds for the night battle, although I move Euclid up to see if the combined large force assault would offer any better odds, and it doesn't. The night battle with Diogenes alone against the city garrison is predicting a victory, albeit with heavy losses. Normally I'm not great at city assaults, but I feel we can do better here. Our night attack has excluded the large enemy land army, but not their small navy, the few garrison ships, or the city garrison itself, so we're still facing a relatively large number of Ethiopians here. And as you can see, the balance bar now on the battlefield itself is actually in the enemy favor. We have several entrances to the town we can exploit, so I'm going to split the army up to see if we can outmaneuver their forces. My 2 regiments of mercenary African elephants that were hired by Argyrios will be coming in from the south. I try to dedicate some pike and spear regiments each to the western and southern approaches, and I place my cavalry off to the northwestern side to form the pincher arm opposite the elephants. My archers and the Lithobolos line up near the safety of the pike walls on the west. The enemy garrison appear to be mostly bunched up on the northern side of the city, so I start moving up my southern flanking force, first ordering the pikes to secure the southern entrance to the city, while the elephants move off toward the coast to see if any of the enemy ships are brave enough to land. The African skirmish cavalry quickly move around to the southwestern city entrance, and I order up our archers to see if I can either whittle them down or draw them out to our spears. The rest of the garrison infantry start marching south through the city center. They seem to be following the lead of their skirmish cavalry, most of the units funneling toward that southwestern exit. As my archers open fire against the enemy horsemen, I send forward my pikes on the west to set up their phalanx formations at the other western entrances, before beginning their deadly march inward. At the same time, there's now an inviting route into the city along the shoreline that's virtually undefended now, and I send my elephants along this route, while the southern pikes hurry inward to the city to set up their formation, and the hoplites swing around the southwestern corner to set up a flanking attack in case the enemy venture out. With only 2 infantry missile regiments remaining on the north side, it's time for Diogenes and his cavalry to start making their way into the city. The route is a bit circuitous, but we'll soon have forces pouring in from all sides, and this is shaping up to go very well. A couple of African hunter regiments push their way through the ranks to the front of the column, presumably to return fire, but they're outclassed and outgunned by the Nubian bows, and the African arrows are mostly deflected by the relatively heavy armor of the advancing Phalangitai regiment. The first melee engagement starts as the African garrison spears encounter the pike wall advancing down the southern city street, and while it will probably take us a while to cut them down, they stand no chance in the long run against the virtually impenetrable pike wall bounded by buildings on each side. The elephants make their way into the city square, and my Phalangitai on the west smash into the African hunters. Diogenes and the cavalry make short work of the garrison archers on the north side, one regiment falling quickly under the hooves of the horses, and the other fleeing in vain back toward the center of the city, only to find a flanking force of skirmish cavalry bearing down on them. The enemy column, hemmed in from the front and sides, and unable to break through the pike wall on the southern side, suffer one of the most brutal rear strikes I've ever seen, as the 1st Regiment of Elephants thunder in from the town square and absolutely maul the clustered enemy ranks, almost immediately working themselves into a berserk state. The enemy garrison is in deep trouble, and they seem to know it, as it takes perhaps 3 seconds for nearly half of the units to begin wavering from the impact of the elephant charge. My pikes and hoplite press forward, the frightened garrison archers and cavalry trying to retreat from the Seleukid spears in a panic, but with mayhem erupting in the rear of their column as the elephants run riot amongst the terrified African soldiers, and even more fuel is added to the fire as my archers and Lithobolos teams arc their projectiles into the dense enemy formation. Diogenes realizes the only danger to his men is represented by the out-of-control war elephants, and I try to restrain the pikes on the southern side when they break their enemies to keep them out of harm's way, and redirect the elephants further into the enemy column when their mental state permits. After perhaps a minute and a half of this rampage, the enemy column are completely broken, and the elephants just run around like mad, swatting and stomping the fleeing enemies, as I withdraw my pikemen, who look on with a mix of awe and horror. The battle isn't officially over, as the enemy naval units are just now making landfall, but they seem at best unenthusiastic to take part in the one-sided carnage unfolding inside the city, 2 of their missile marine units already wavering before they've even disembarked. With that said, the scariest moment of the battle then takes place, as a berserk elephant regiment starts pursuing some fleeing enemy cavalry in the direction of my pikes, who try in desperation to move out of the way of the 6,000-pound biological tanks. Fortunately, I'm pleasantly surprised to see my men seem to have survived mostly unscathed, as the elephants were mostly interested in the fleeing African regiments. Nekurasan, the enemy admiral, and his Numidian swordsmen are greeted in their coastal approach by the berserk elephants, who seem to have plenty of bloodlust left to make another charge into their retinue. The Numidian swordsmen have pretty decent morale, but under the circumstances they can't be blamed for their failure to hold their ground. As the admiral and his retinue rout before the onslaught, the naval archers make no pretense about fighting, and make the smart decision to get off the battlefield. It's perhaps only because they're dumbfounded that the remaining unit of spearmen watch their commander's unit being dismembered, and manage not to flee in terror, holding out just long enough to find themselves in the elephant riders' crosshairs, and it's at this moment that they find their wits and flee.
There goes another one. Run him down, yes. That's how you destroy a foe. How many dead, Agurios? 71. How can that be? We killed more than that with the catapult. Oh, 71 of ours. They will be mourned. Wait, only 7 you say, to the Blumii, and the rest due to our own elephants. Well, those don't count. Mark it down, Agurios. 7 casualties. I'll have it be known that Diogenes is a man who cares about his soldiers. Gods, look at the destruction wrought by these beasts, it's spectacular. The casualties from the forced march in the desert? No, we don't officially count those either. Although each life lost brings pain to my— There goes another one, stomp him flat.
An absolutely crushing victory for Diogenes. Under the circumstances, I don't think the term decisive does it justice. The elephant regiments, though costly to maintain, proved their worth in this battle, taking down nearly 1,200 Blimii between them. Although we suffered double-digit losses in the battle, most of those appear to be my fault through friendly fire or friendly trampling, as the nearly 4,000 town defenders managed to kill only 7 of our men. I can't help but think even Seleukos himself would approve of this victory. With the city under our control, we can now deal with the rest of the nearby Blimii, and Euclid does so with Diogenes' help, dispatching their army with an auto-resolve and thereby annihilating their faction completely. During the intern phase, Hyostan continued their repeated pleas for help against Archae Bosphoros, again declined, and Takashila renewed their war effort against Drangiana. Having only just recently reached terms with us over the previous conflict that included costly war reparations. Of course, we'll continue to support our satrapy in the conflict, although it remains to be seen if we'll have to commit any troops to this faraway struggle. Diogenes and the Golden Fleece are at almost full strength after their incredible victory last turn, so he and his men board their transports from the port of Ptolemais Theron and set off into the Red Sea towards Arabia, while Euclid and the Wisdom of the Goose remain behind to replenish their numbers. I want to get rid of some of Euclid's weak levies and replace them with something better. I'm a bit limited in what I can purchase due to the lack of Greek culture locally, although for some reason I can get royal peltasts here. They're fairly expensive though, and what I really need are cavalry, so I instead purchased some light Ethiopian cavalry who have both swords and javelins. A nice combination, their main disadvantage being low morale and armor. Antigonos Doson reinitiates his siege of Phillipopolis with his now slightly stronger army, while Antiochos Theos and Cordylion remain at the walls and port respectively of Pella, now unopposed in their siege and blockade by the local forces. As father and son, co-regents now prepare to deliver the final thrust to dispatch Macedon and bring the region under Seleukid control via their Antigonid puppet Antigonos Doson, Cordylion, the leader of the other noble houses, remains loyal, but perhaps a small seed of envy has taken root in his heart against the self-proclaimed god prince of the empire. Meanwhile, to the south and east, conflict against our allies and satrapies continues relatively unchecked, as Diogenes sails towards new lands of conquest in Arabia. Euclid consolidates the African holdings, and Euclid steers off into the gathering storm clouds of the Bosphorine kingdom on the northeastern frontier.